So the U.S. is urging South Africa to clarify its stance on the war in Ukraine. Now, backing the European Union's push for President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration to take a harder line against the Russian invasion. Now, they say on the day the invasion began, South Africa's foreign ministry urged Russia to immediately withdraw its forces and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. A day later, Ramaphosa took a different take, saying that Joe Biden should agree to an unconditional meeting with Vladimir Putin to avert war and call for dialogue, which that would be a good thing, right? He's saying while the U.S. supports South Africa's call for negotiations, it also wants a strong, unified stance against Russia. Now, they say acting U.S. Ambassador Todd Haskell said in remarks aired on Johannesburg-based broadcaster ENCA. Now, he says, and I quote, "We think it's really important when we look at the unprovoked aggression, this attack against democracy, Russia's war against Ukraine, Putin's war on Ukraine, it's important to say it is wrong." Now, it says South Africa is also among 16 of the Africa's 54 nations that, like China and India, abstained this week from voting on a United Nations resolution condemning the incursion. Now, I say 8 of the nations were present for the vote and 1, Eritrea, opposed it. Now, South Africa's response to the war reflects an attempt to balance historic ties to Russia with its economic links to the U.S. and also Europe. Now, Russia was also a key ally in the ruling African National Congress fight against the white minority rule that ended in 1994. So Russia was against the apartheid government and supported black people. And like South Africa is a member of the 5-nation group of emerging markets known as BRICS. Now, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, still, they say Russia's economic ties to South Africa are negligible, they say, when compared with the EU and the U.S., which, along with China, rank as its top 3 trading partners. Now, the EU ambassador to South Africa, Rina Kionka, said she expressed frustration with South Africa's position. Why are you frustrated, ma'am, or sir, whoever? Why are you frustrated? Why? They said what they said. This what the response is. I'm sorry, ma'am. I meant to say ma'am. Sitting on the fence is not an option. That's what the female said in a email response to questions. Say, once we figure out what the South African government stance really is, the EU will consider what the repercussions are, she said. Now, hold on. It is not South Africa's war. South Africa didn't say, hey, Russia, go over there and invade Ukraine. South Africa haven't sent any troops over there. Matter of fact, their students have been trapped and they're trying to get their students back home. Why is it that you got to tell South Africa, no, you take a position? You basically trying to bully South Africa to say what they want them to say. Why? If anybody needs to say something, the EU needs to say something, because that's a war in your backyard. You, matter of fact, need to go over there and stop Putin yourself. That's in your backyard. Why are you worrying about what South Africa got to say about it? It doesn't make sense. Talking about some repercussions. So what is that supposed to mean? You want to start putting sanctions on South Africa because they say, well, I don't really want to get involved with that. Now, the president come out, and he's waiting.
Well, the man makes a very obvious good point. The United Nations was created. I mean, this is how the United Nations was presented to the world, as an organization, an instrument, a vehicle through which basically to stop wars, to end wars, to in the least of its expressions, one could say, to resolve wars, which means to diffuse wars. It's all the same, right? Yet what we're seeing is, one thing that catches my attention all the time when I watch the General Assembly and the Security Council gather, that they all come with a piece of paper that sounds exactly like what the guy before them said. I mean, they're almost like carbon copies of each other. Occasionally, there's one who obviously decided to take a different position and sounds nothing like what the majority of the past 10 representatives or 20 representatives said, and they took a different position on the matter. But in the end result is that 70 or 80% or 90%, 70 not even. Usually it's more. Usually it's 80, 90% of the countries all agree on that carbon copied letter in terms of what the majority said. And the ones that decided to speak their own truth come off as the minority pariah, that the difficult ones, as this man is making the case for South Africa. And what it makes me imagine the United Nations as, instead of a place where all countries meet, like if you can imagine a pie and the pie shapes going towards the center of 190 or 205 or how many countries we are now, going all towards the center and in an equal distribution around a point. It's more like actually concentric rings of the same material that almost complete the circle, and then a larger ring, perhaps a stronger ring that has probably a smaller perimeter pressuring down on that on the the ultimate smallest ring around the center, that is where all the people are speaking, what we see resulting of the processes. So, and all of it is just unglobal. A group of 5 here and a group of 20 there and a group of 7 there, and they're all kind of centered around certain protagonist countries. And then you have a vast majority of countries whose intelligence, whose ideas may be as valuable as any idea proposed by Germany or America or France, and yet you never hear from these countries. They just kind of sit there and produce their carbon copied letter. And so, without getting into how much of an offense, how much of an insult to the population of the world ultimately the performance of the United Nations is demonstrating to be. Because if you tell somebody, hey, we're going to do this and trust me, we're going to design it, we're going to make it in a way that's going to bring peace. Imagine that. It's like saying, the thing that humanity has always hoped for, we're going to deliver it. And then it turns out that it's being used to create political forces, to pressuring everybody to be on the same side on an issue, and then singling out a group of countries as the bad ones, and they have to sit there and say, yeah, we're the bad ones, we're China, we're Russia, we're the bad ones, and we're here faking that we're in a circle of equals. It's terrible. It's a failure. I don't know how best to describe it. It's, why are we putting up with this? Why are we, humoring and giving it honor and dignity and all the big, huge building in New York as if it was really the achievement of political diplomacy for the planet? And really, it isn't. It's just something that is perversely being used and manipulated by certain forces and small groups of countries. In any case, I'm not here to criticize the UN. I'm here to talk about how it should be reformed, how it could be reformed. And of course, it's along the lines of what I always talk about, Gaia Humanism, because it speaks of the ways in which it can be reconfigured and transformed, go along the lines of humanist comprehension of human society, and things that we can all relate to, how individuals relate to one another, how family members and friends and people in a small village or town respect and regard each other and treat one another. This is not, you don't need to have a rocket science degree in politics to be able to understand how the United Nations could work for what it is proposed to do. Is it a good idea? Yes, it's an excellent idea. And it's really a shame to have a United Nations. It's actually a shame, a tragic disgrace that we have installed the apparatus that connects to every head of government. So we already have the instrument there. We don't have to make the effort of convincing everybody to join around a circle. We already have it there, except that it's being used, with the wrong software, sort of say. We have the hardware that we needed being used with the wrong software for other purposes that are not bringing peace to the planet. Now, we could argue, some people argue, when you want to talk about, can humanity have a world where wars are a thing of the past? Yes. Yes, of course we can. We just need to want that. You have to believe it, but not because you would, you have to convince everybody to the last detail on how human nature could finally be coerced or forced or pressured by the perfect system or by the way of enforcing the behavior of countries. I got lost there. I don't know. I went off somewhere. I don't know. In any case, I'm just going to go straight to the point. The key to the world working properly and ending wars and countries getting along is the word respect, basically. Respect. That's all we need to do. We need to respect each other as equal nations, equally important, equally significant, equally entitled to the planet, equal in all the rights that concern human rights, not ideologies, not saying, hey, you need to be like this because this is an ideology of human behavior. No, I'm talking about the ideologies in terms of actually, I'm not talking about ideologies. I got lost again. To understand respect among all nations, equality of respect among all nations, all you have to do is think about how you are in your immediate surrounding of friends and family, and when you talk about how we behave to one another. And we all can relate to being a better person in terms of respecting other people. For example, you don't take advantage of somebody who's too nice. It's simple stuff that we all know. You can be generous with somebody when they're in need, but you don't want to raise a child by always doing things for them and making them spoiled or stupid and not grow up to appreciate their own sense of decision and their own character towards the life, weakening the character that they're going to develop for their life. There are things that we can all talk about that have to do with how we relate to one another. You don't abuse somebody who's weaker. You don't take from somebody who already you see has very little left, and just because they're desperate and they need money, they're willing to sell their last whatever, and you run to it and buy it all up, not caring what's going to happen to that person. Of course you don't. You may say, no, wait, let's buy it from this other person who has too much of it, and he only needs so much, and that person is appropriate for buying some of that from. Ideas of respecting people are completely applicable to the ideas of respecting each other as nations. The United Nations wasn't thought that way. For one thing, demographically, it doesn't express the population of the planet. If humanity is going to run its world of countries it needs to start with representing the population of humanity, not representing countries. Then we would have a way of distributing the will of humankind towards the running of the planet. So if it just so happens that countries contain a certain amount of that population, well, then that comes later. That, it shouldn't be really the ruling principle or the power factor in the running of the United Nations, because the United Nations is to serve humanity, the planet, the globe, life. The United Nations should be an organic concept, and thus all people should be represented in the sense of every single human being equally represented towards that center. Ultimately, people represent or form natural nations. The formation of a nation is a natural occurrence. Even animals, they create packs, or they have different families, and whales, they may be the same species, but they stay in this area. A nation is a totally organic representation of a group, an organic, a natural representation of a group, of a human group. But the weight of that nation in the United Nations should not have to do with the military, the financial, the economic power, the power in the world that country has, because the United Nations is serving all of humanity. It's not serving certain countries and then other countries follow or tag along. That means that we need to redesign and reconfigure the whole United Nations. Another important element is language. Language carries knowledge, carries everything that we have made as a civilization. Every science, every building, every complex idea in politics or philosophy took the form given to it by the use of language. It's everything. What we come to believe about existence is given to us by language. And language is completely, how can I say it, essential in the quality and the substance that will be embodied in the things in everything that we do. So, considering that language is very personally owned by a people and their interest in their nation, and they're inseparable, all the human feelings, pride, need, relating to that bonds that makes one out of the people and their nation, their organic nation. We should be very vigilant as to the distribution of languages, because if one language is the one that speaks all the time, what we're hearing is the will of one people and that nation, or those nations that are bonded by language in many ways, in different intensities, depending on the group of nations that we're talking about. There aren't many nations that are bonded by language. The ones that contain most nations through language are the Spanish, I believe, the Spanish nations perhaps, but then you have the English possibly second, but each one of the English nations is very large and strong, powerful financially. There may be more Spanish, but what I'm getting at is the homogeneity of will not necessarily is stronger in our world, in the group of nations, and in the Spanish representation of nations. It seems that by looking at the world, the English nations have more, they're more on the same page kind of thing. And that is completely through cultural transmission. We're not judging people here. We're talking about the strength of homogenizing through cultural, through language. Language facilitates the homogenization of societies and cultures. And the more proliferous they are in technologies and communications, the more that language homogenizes, especially today. Now, the whole world is potentially could be talking to itself as one and listening to itself as one if we perfected our technologies of translation. But in any case, what I'm getting at is that if we were to truly create an instrument to drive the world, to guide the world, to drive it, to organize it, to administrate it, to heal it, to wisely take care of the world, it also needs to equally represent all languages, because each language contains an equal expression of human intelligence. So to make an example, if people who speak English invent a way of curing a disease or go through a procedure of many years and towards solving a problem of chemistry or health or engineering or civil philosophy, it is as worthy, it's as meaningful, as significant, I mean to say, towards humanity, towards human beings, towards people, than that solution that would have been proposed by years of development towards civil philosophy, towards some chemical health problem that, where research and stuff underwent through a period of time and came up with finally a solution. And every single other language, and it would be distinct to the collective intelligence of the society that that language embodies. So this is sort of comparable to what in or self-sustaining agriculture science, when we talk about keeping the variety of plants, because the overall collective of different strains is what makes ultimately the ecological system of agriculture strong. And if you only create one strain of potatoes, well, you could be left without potatoes overnight if something happens, like some bug, or if that potato maybe has a problem in a certain type of weather and we don't see it right away, but we're left with that kind of potato, and in 15 years, suddenly the average temperature drops below a certain, and all of a sudden, all potatoes are wiped out. In ecology, the whole collective design of the whole planet is important. And by the same metaphor, we need to express as much of human intelligence in all its different pie-shaped progressions of logic that arrive to solutions that run the world or solve the world or heal the world or invent the world by each society. Otherwise, well, without making it too complicated, what we see is countries and empires that have had more power, military power, and force have destroyed other cultures in all their sophistication. They have either conquered them or they have influenced them to the point where they don't even know if they're worthy of what they do anymore, and they just start copying the other country and they become like the other country, which is kind of more the case in modern times. But still, we also literally destroy their architecture, literally destroy, disrespect, and it all comes to the same word, the word respect, because if we respect each other as people, it also means, okay, if we respect each other as countries, it is the same as respecting each other as people. You don't talk over the other one. You honor that they are about to say something that you may not know. And so you stop and listen, and then you talk and you think about that's not how we're running the world right now. Right now, we have countries that want to push other countries to do what they want. So that means, and the United Nations is not helping at all in solving this condition. Um, so one of the ways in which the United Nations would have to be reinvented, reconfigured, is in having more authority. Of course, people say, want to run a global Orwellian world with the United. No, we shouldn't fear what we are capable of creating, because we are capable of doing good to ourselves, and we are capable of doing things the right way, the loving, the organic way. We're not, prey or subject or victims of our intelligence. We have been victims to our intelligence, but it's only because we haven't recognized that we are. But that's for another Gaia humanist video. What I'm getting at is that the United Nations could function as an immune system, as an administrative body that has no self-invested interest. How do you create a United Nations that has no self-invested interest? Is sort of like, if you can imagine a spider web or a tent, a circus tent, where the circle in the middle is held up by all the tension around it, but it has no force in itself. If the circle in the circus tent were not being pulled by all ends, and if the spider web was not being pulled from the outside, that circle in the middle would not be there. The United Nations basically should be configured, should be designed the same way. It should be on an island or a piece of land that was donated by some country, that is autonomous, that does not belong to any country's jurisdiction, and in it, everything should be presented in a radial way. So countries would come forth with their equally important proposal or solution to all the other countries, given a matter. That means that every single language would have a different philosophy, or a slightly different philosophy. Many would have in common similar things, but you certainly wouldn't have carbon copy presentations next to one another in different languages speaking one language. What you would have is every country presenting their solution in their language, and perhaps ultimately, there could be a global language designed and created, which would not be a bad thing at all, which could be done through Gaia humanist principle of bringing the best of all grammar, of all languages, and grammar and phonetics and musicality and versatility and usefulness and practicality. And then, today with the technologies that we have, we could totally invent a global language, and it would not take from anyone. It could be every country's second language, and and it could someday be the primary language for all countries while they continue to speak their own language. But it could be done in a way that is rich, and I didn't mean to speak about that right now, but I'm saying the concept is expandable. The concept of true Gaia humanism and representation, in this case, in the redesign of the United Nations, has already ways to think about it. Has already the right ways to think about it, and it needs to be based on the absolute equality of between nations and the respect that they give each other, which also means a certain amount of ethics. What we every nation should not only um, not abuse, not lie or what have you, not try to manipulate or try to have more power than the other ones, but should also care about the other, just like a because ultimately, if we want the world to work together, for example, Borneo is the country that most for apparently most wild. Well, the Amazon still has more forest than all the other ones, but Borneo is like the one that now is still being present, where the country does not have the resources, unlike Brazil, to decimate its forest yet. And so, if if Japan needs, wants to maintain a vigorous furniture industry, let's say, um, basically the principle of the United Nations would be is that Japan itself would not just because Borneo wants to catch up with the rest of the world, or Borneo is Indonesia now, I think, or no, it's its own country. Excuse my ignorance, but would not seek to take advantage of the fact that they sell their wood so cheaply, but they would say, no, we restrain ourselves. We're not going to buy more than 5%, every 10 years, because you need 10 years to grow it back. We'll buy 2% from you and 2% from Congo and 2% from Brazil, and that way we'll satisfy our own needs while taking into consideration the health and the healing of the planet as a whole. And every country would be as responsible towards one another, just like brothers and sisters are responsible for one another. Brothers, you don't do your brother's homework because you know that he has to learn how to do his own homework, his own homework. So this is basically the principle that could work. We need to now. People think that when they think about ending wars, the first thing you think about is, well, we got to get rid of nuclear weapons. Yeah, ultimately that needs to happen. But it's through the proper ethics in how countries treat each other and relate to each other and respect a central authority, because there would need to be more respect towards a well centralized United Nations. And that would mean that for some countries it would be a little more difficult, and for other countries it wouldn't be so difficult to respect the United Nations. And it would probably be opposite to what it is right now for the countries that most appetite, most power have are the ones that would probably be constantly being pushed back by the United Nations. But what was I getting at? Yeah, that we have to think about it in terms of not first getting rid of weapons. We have to think about how we treat each other first, because eventually, once we get going on United Nations as working properly as a central nervous system that is, keeping the family, respecting one another, and restocking the oceans of fish, and replanting the resources that we're consuming, and making sure that the world is producing sustainable energies, enough for the whole population and everything. Eventually, once we get along, we will have no need to fight one another. Now, there's also the matter of today, wars are also fueled by the appetite of corporations to generate more profit, unfortunately, and just the overall sense of, aspects like wanting to have more power, not lose power, would be solved by the ethical aspect of a different United Nations. Money would have, the financial means of the world would have to be transformed. But actually, that too has a simple solution, which is no more secrecy, basically. And a lot of people think this is outrageous. I mean, how dare you expect somebody to not be able to hide their money? When you think about it, what does it hurt for people to know how much money you have? This is, it's like an unfounded fear. If you remove secrecy from money, meaning it's just there, anybody can see. Let's imagine that every single bill and every single coin has a chip that's GPS locatable, and as soon as it's produced, you know where every bill goes in the world. And people can't stash it anywhere, or they can't keep a cost secret or a profit secret or a salary secret, but everything has to be transparent. Basically, what would be enacting by doing that is our own natural collective sense of sensible balance. Like people behave better when everybody's watching them, basically. And that's not about fear, or it's not about phoniness, or it's just the way society is. There are forces that push individuals to maybe run faster and get away with something or something. But ultimately, the ruling force is the collective. I mean, evolution moves forward its collective life form as a whole. And within that are forces that push inside of that and maybe ultimately create a new species or create a new language of people that split off somewhere. But above that, the greater overall gentle but primary force is the collective. And so it's okay to acknowledge that we behave better when everybody knows us and calls us on what they feel like calling us on, and sees what we're doing, and we feel free and to talk about other people and talk to the people that we're concerned about and directly to. And I mean, the way society works is what actually amalgamates it all, keeps it. If you look at the people that cause the most harm, strange murderers or whatever, serial killers or what do you call them? Active shooters, look at their personalities. They're usually people that were not contained in a healthy, gregarious, vivacious group of people, social, collective, communicative people, with a lot of friends and family that came in and out of that person's life. You usually go off in some kind of psychological isolation. So there you go. So a healthy society, that's not what I'm trying to talk about. I was talking about money. The same principle would apply to getting rid of secrecy, because then what you would have is people would not. The result would be that there wouldn't be excesses anymore of people making all this money and other people not making as much, or some people having a whole lot of money and then some people having nothing, and nobody can talk about it. We talk about poverty and we talk about, but instead of trying to force equality, the means would be through the way we treat money. Because money basically is a very powerful agent. It's a great invention for civilization. It does. It's amazing. It's as an artifice. Its power. But it appeals to a part of our human nature that we're never going to change, which is basically the fear of being left without, the suspicion, the not knowing what's going to happen, the always making sure that we don't drop, that we're capable of floating, that we'll be strong before something that in front of something that is hostile. I mean, the insecurity that we evolved with in this material, in this natural world. We evolved for 95% or 99% under constant threat of diseases and predators and hunger and weather that, you know, clobbers us. And so there's a part of our nature, and they typically refer to as fear, but it's a little bit more sophisticated. That's it's insecurity that we will continue, insecurity that we will in believing that we will continue to thrive is more precise. And so when money allows us to boom, just buy food, boom, just build a house, shelter, have a car, feel powerful, you know, be attractive, and so forth. It's very, very. It's not even addictive. Addictive is too light. It's almost like putting a column inside a jungle shack and then seeing, wow, I never thought that I could make my shack that strong. You know, you don't want to get rid of it. You know, and that's why you see rich people just are never comfortable with having, you know, tomorrow being less rich. It's a constantly growing thing that doesn't know how to deflate, and therefore produces all of the problems it produces. Now, by money being non-secretive, that we're not being able to hide it anywhere, not be able to stash it in how we use it or any way, what we'd be doing is we'd be exposing our behavior to everybody regarding money. And so there would be more of a tendency to regulate, to check ourselves, to put our natural sort of ethical and moral observations on things that right now we keep money away from, because it's really, that's the problem. That's really the problem. We don't need so hard. Later, you know, after we deal with this in a humanist way, after we deal with redesigning the United Nations in a humanist, this is my definition of Gaia humanism, is going by the natural form of the socially evolved human being's mind. After we redesign the use of money through a Gaia humanist way, then we'll see, well, this is the best that we are capable of naturally doing without telling each other what to do, or without forcing things to be used or designed a certain way. This is the best that we'll do, just by allowing the natural way that society and the human mind has been designed collectively by evolution to run things, to run the world, to run nations, to use money. And then we can all agree to say, well, you know what, we still wish that this would be less extreme, so we can fine tune it in transparent ways that everybody sees, and see if it results, see if it works well, see if this invention, this way of tweaking things, obtains a better result that we can all be happy with. All right, so that's basically it. I'm going to leave a link to this. I haven't finished watching it.
Then on the invasion of Ukraine, and he's calling for a dispute to be settled through mediation rather than through the barrel of the gun. Now, so writing his weekly open letter.
It's really incredible that we actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about the internet. It's really incredible that with all the things that we are exposed to, with all the truisms that we're exposed to, there isn't a reaction by saying, oh my God, we can't let this injustice continue on. I mean, we know things that, this country has always actually really wanted to achieve this, against Russia or whatever, or Russia has always been made out to be the bad guy, and really it's just a people and a nation that has to deal with the world and the forces that are affecting it, just like other countries are, and do not have the privilege of all of the world media as being dominated and and written by their language. They don't have that. They can't. They don't get to fill the libraries and the magazines and the newspapers of the world with the narratives that describe their justice and what their engagement with the other winning countries after World War I was like. We are the ones. We are the ones that describe the World War II, and it's just according to the way we say it. And then, the Germans don't get to describe World War II, and if they are now, it sure sounds a lot like what the British would say they need to describe it like. They don't really describe World War II as it happened to them. And a lot of things seem obvious, but nobody knows what there's nothing to do about it. We need to make it that. We need to make the right world. If nobody gets up and makes the right world, the lesser, more fearful, well, a better definition than fearful was, worried that something will threaten our thriving force. Lesser fearful, let's just say, part of human nature will continue to want to elbow everything out of the way, and so empires and countries continue. They come up like soufflés. They come up until there's something that reoccurs, that keeps recurring in human civilization, that can't seem to stop. It's like we grow until something collapses, and then another one starts on the other side of the world. Another one starts, and then again it tries to take over the world, and it collapses. We keep repeating the same thing, and nobody has stopped to think, what is happening to us? What about our mind is it that keeps creating the same problems, the same reoccurring patterns in human history? And so that's where Gaia Humanism comes in, which is basically the principle of understanding the unchangeable parts of our nature, not in a judgmentally ideological conceptual way, but really understanding how evolution made us and all of the variables that can happen simultaneously in a three-dimensional way of thinking about existence, not in a linear way of describing this is how you got to understand it. No, I have another description. No, I have another description. No, all of these things are true because we are three-dimensional temporal beings. That it says, yeah, he observed that, she observed that, he observed this other aspect, and they're all true. And this is how we have to understand existence and the human mind in a spatial way. So once we not agree, but then once we finally map out how our nature is and all the many angles on how things how we could behave differently according to all of these different circumstances, then we have to acknowledge that our logical analytical prowess, our precocious intelligence that invents and solves, analyzes, and creates the material way, our material home in which our civilization, in which we place ourselves within, has a dissynchony with what we ultimately will always feel more comfortable, which is our natural self. So this is what I explained in Gaia Humanism. It wasn't what I wanted to talk about today, but basically we need to create a human science that is about running the world. We don't. That sounds. Human science understands us like like a hobby, like a collectionist understands a certain car and knows even what bolts were made a certain way, and the threads are thicker when they were produced in this other factory, and they know the car inside out and how it works and what every single little problem is and when it will happen. We know that's how we have to know ourselves, our brain three-dimensionally, temporally made by evolution. And then we have to become the subject is how we are affected and what we can do, therefore, with the ability of our logical analytical intelligence, which is what makes chairs and proposes a civil philosophy and what cures diseases and understands astronomy. And that part of our intelligence will never care to naturally have a tendency to care about doing what is optimal and healthiest for the natural design. It just doesn't, it just has its own thing going. And so we never been aware of that as a civilization, as an existential predicament. We've simply made the world that we thought was going to work for having, growing more this or defending ourselves from whatever problem or what have you. And we've never really had a knowledge or a science about how that will end up affecting our life, the life of the human species, the living collective of the human being. We have no discourse on understanding, on even observing that perpetual disbalance, perpetual incongruency. The science of Gaia humanism is one that observes right there, that area, that constant, oh yeah, it looks like it's helping. Wow, look at all it did for us. And boom, there is the expected harm or disharmony or totally off. We got it all wrong. That's just not going to work for us. We just never looked at that interaction, that space of interaction as a civilization. We never had, a lot of things would have to change, of course. We'd have to start thinking in terms of we, all of us, we as a human being, and we are very shy and we don't allow ourselves, we have other philosophical ideologies that say you shouldn't think for somebody else, and, whatever, and we're all individuals. And we have other stuff that fights the growth of a knowledge of us, a knowledge of we. So that's one thing that we would have to come to terms with and be okay with. And it's not a matter of enforcing anything, because there are things that we are and things that we're not. And there are things that we may be sometimes and may not be other times. And that's all. And that's we. All of it is we. We may be like that sometimes, and we may not be that way sometimes. And we will always be like that sometimes, and we will never be like that some other times. This we does exist, a we that includes every single one of our 7 billion people. And so having the ability, the confidence to stand in that we is something that we also, for some reason, have never been able to have. But it also, we need to, in order to see what our logical analytical intelligence that invents and designs and builds the world, and the world that we should also abide by through administration and ways of understanding society, in order to understand how all of that part of our logical and analytical intelligence will in order to make us vigilant, to see when it's not helping our natural design and when it's enhancing it. When obviously it's not a matter of fighting the things that are lesser, something the instances that we may rob an apple from a market, let's say, to give an example. Nobody really wants to do any harm. That's the whole thing. Today's civilization has always been based on this idea that separation of evil and good, and being that evil comes from something that was created, comes from the natural primitive species, or put on the earth by God or something. We haven't come to terms with the fact that it's just something that displeases us that we will do. And we've also never come to appreciate that ultimately we prefer not to do things that harm, that are disliked by others or disliked by us. We actually don't. Peace among people, peace among nations is actually the stable, greater state of existence. There isn't, we don't live in a state of existence that is a battle between fighting and not fighting. No, we actually prefer to not fight, to not hurt others, to not rob. And to understand ourselves in these different ways would be not something that the whole planet could achieve overnight. I think we all need to continue educating us like we have for thousands of years, but in new ways, in better ways, in philosophically more organically true ways. And I don't want to get into Gaia humanism again, but because this was just meant to be about the United Nations. It's already 57 minutes. I can never make it less than an hour. It's terrible. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. And but yeah, the United Nations is the way to go. Basically, we have to realize that we shouldn't waste any more time and really sit down and say, okay, we have this area. Let's redesign it. Let's make it in a way that it works, that it takes care of humanity, that instead of moving around power and trying to formalize war through phases or involvement, peacekeepers, to try to make war work more gently or something weird. It needs to analyze the problems and solve those problems. If the problem, just to give an example that is already old, I think we moved past it, but if you look at, for example, the history of Iran alone, recent modern history, the internet is full of documentaries that will explain to you how the British went there, the oil, and then the Americans came in their place, tag team, and and then they started getting upset because they saw that the Americans preferred this other leader, the Shah, and really they didn't like the Shah. They liked their democracy. They found something that they liked, but we could not leave them in peace. This guy wants to keep what we've, what they figured out, or the richness that they've learned to manage. They want to now use it for themselves, and that's always where we've had problems in the past. It's always the same. You go to Latin America, it's always the same story. This is not like being a commie, being a lefty, or being an anti-anything. I mean, the internet is full of this. All you have to do is want to educate yourself and not just, sit there and let what mainstream media easily has put together to please the powers that be for you to gobble up, and nobody thinks anymore. No, I mean, if you really want to understand what happened in Libya, what happened in Iran, what happened in Egypt, every single country has an alternative story, that the story, the true story, that is not what the mass media has educated us to believe. Same thing goes recently in Bolivia. It's like, the United States, and so they found some Argentinian there to try to do something with Evo Morales and get rid of Evo Morales, and and then they Guaido. I mean, Jesus Christ. The legitimate president from where? From where? We decided we're going to call him president, and you all now have to say that he's the president because we want him to be president. It's so absurd, and yet people just say, okay, that's what we have to believe. Well, and people start repeating it. Well, no. If you want to, you can find the real story, okay? And people voted for Maduro. They wanted him for a bunch of reasons. You want to know for those reasons what those reasons are? Look at the history of oil, the United States. It's always the same story. People want to have pride, a sense of independence, a sense of ownership, but mainly a sense of, we are doing this with our own hands. This is natural in every country. Some countries are old and take it for granted. They have self-pride. They feel that maybe they're following another country as a phase in history, but other countries really have a problem with identity because they were colonially treated. And so as soon as they realize, they figure out that they're being used, they react very strongly because they want to, and Iran is very ancient, but in modern times, changes happened, and they saw that, and they said, no, we know exactly what's going on here, and we don't want to allow it. And that's where it all started. That's why they got upset, and they kidnapped the Americans in the embassy. And so, if a United Nations is to solve world relationships between countries, it needs to take, with all courage and honesty, the true development of facts in history, and say, well, how you must understand that a people felt indignant, they felt used, because of people. The emotions in a society ultimately are what erupt in governments making decisions. And we are mistaken in thinking that emotions are not important. We think that practicality and function, administration system, and the actual event all of a sudden becomes very important and endowed with all of the motivation. In reality, we are a constantly living emotion through society that creates all the many little events and things that happen, all of which in a certain group kind of interact with other reactions that another country had. And yeah, then all of a sudden there's one outstanding event or decision that's, but we're not, when we do that, we're not honoring how the heart of a people feel, which is more accurate as the placement, which is more accurate in its placement of explanation regarding what happened. So you need to understand, well, you can hardly blame Nicaragua or Iran or Venezuela reacting this way when all their people started seeing, or interpreting these actions a certain way. Even if they're wrong, you have to honor a country go through the emotions that they need to go through, and that's just who they are, what they are. You can't force your interpretation, your anything on other countries, which means equal respect among all nations. So, as in this sense, the United Nations would resolve problems by taking history and acknowledging that each country's people are aware of their history and very much take into consideration and the motivating factor and emotions that now give voice and materialize the arguments and the events that are now happening. But we don't have a strong entity that does that. So as basically what we have is the capricious smarts of a handful of people in government that say, let's say this because we want to win the argument, and we'll say that it's all about what just happened. People pick up the paper and read, oh, well, it must be about this, I guess. And nobody is really talking about what has really happened in that conflict. So who would be the one to speak honestly and sincerely, earnestly, what has been happening historically in that particular conflict? We couldn't really make one country or another country do it. It would have to be the United Nations. The United Nations would be the one, for example, also to say, but we have to also give it authority, because the United Nations maybe sometimes does this, sometimes picks up historically what happened, but nobody cares. Nobody says, we haven't given it a ruling, pentacle. We haven't really given that to the United Nations. It's weird what it does right now. It's kind of like a plane here among everything, and it doesn't really have any consequence. It does things. I'm not saying about it. Anyways, another thing the United Nations has is the obligatory instrument for that we need is regarding the environment and restocking the oceans with all the animals that are going extinct, and the forests, replanting the forests and cleaning all the rivers, and seeing water as a global element, not as, okay, the river starts here, but, because it's in my country, I can put a dam right here and, whatever. So then the other country's forced to deal with, no, well, what would mediate more successfully, I'm talking about the Nile and the dam that Ethiopia is screwing Egypt with to make it easy. Instead of, forcing a troublesome situation to be resolved in some kind of perhaps not very fair way, ultimately, who knows? The wisest and best way to do that is by an instrument, an administrative instrument to the world that says, okay, so many million people need water, so many million people need this much water, as opposed to that much water. These people are growing in population so fast. These people will make so much money out of water. These people will make so much money out of the same water from the same river, and start treating the situation as a single body of water that runs through two countries and all of the needs of that country, and perhaps start proposing things that have to do with shared, running the dam conjointly, or, which is kind of what they're talking about. But it would have been, it's a good example for things that the United Nations could solve in it from its perspective, from a global perspective. And also because it would make it a lot easier, because there is no invested interest in the United Nations. So if the United Nations say, we're going to run, elephants are about to go extinct, it doesn't become an argument. Well, we have so many in zoos, and another one says, oh, it won't hurt anything. Or another one says, why don't they raise all the elephants over there? They're not doing anything, and no, they hardly have any human population, and so an argument just wastes time. But the United Nations, on the other hand, without any invested interest, can say, well, let's say this is how elephants evolved. This is what they eat. We could just distribute it this way and that way, so they can continue to be in one area, and we'll make part of that area in this country, part of that area, this area in that country, and part of the area in that other country, and that can be a reservation that the three countries run together, and boom, in a week there's a solution, and it doesn't become a fight that lasts 10 years or produces something that ends up allowing for harm to continue anyways. So yeah, the United Nations has got to not only be a humanist thing, but it also has to be organic in its understanding of, because the most important thing that humanity has, the most important thing for the ultimately only most people, religious people will say, no, faith in God and all this stuff, but ultimately, if God created our home planet, it is the only vessel that we have to live for his creation or her creation to live. Even if we think of God, it still is correct to place above us all of us, and maybe before God, if you want, our home, the health of our home planet, and the health of all of us in our entire population. The optimal health of every single person that's born, and the optimal health of the environment that we live in has got to be our priority for anything to be possible, for anything to live and continue having a future. If that is a strong paramount priority, then everything else, and we include it in everything else, it would be a lot easier also to solve other problems that we have, because the most important thing we established is the health of our home world. And so, anyways, this could go on and on and on. But yeah, the United Nations configured by an equal representation of all languages. What I was saying is that before the day we have a global language, one world language, that the point is that each people and each nation bring their concerns, their will. That's really what we're talking about, the will. What some countries are not letting other countries express, their own ingenious, creative, spontaneous, and genuine will towards solving, proposing, resolving, indicating, pointing out of a situation presented in the United Nations. Then once the forum of every language and every country has presented each one of their solutions or answers to whatever the item is, then okay, it gets translated. Maybe in the future it will be a one global language. But for now it can be English or Chinese or Spanish. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it is produced from the will and the unmanipulated reasoning of those people in their own sense of importance, which ought to be equal in significance and worth as to all other nations. Equal, not less important, not following, not leading, just equal around a perfectly centralized United Nations. Okay, that's it. So, thanks for listening.